when my son tossed my old toolbox onto the driveway and told me to take my junk and leave. I didn't say a word. I just picked it up. And when I got to the motel that night and finally opened it, I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time, staring at what was inside, unable to breathe. But let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of man I was before any of this happened. And you need to understand what kind of man my son became and why. My name is Raymond. I'm 67 years old. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer for the county. Designed bridges, overpasses, drainage systems, things most people drive over every day without a second thought. I was proud of that work. My wife Carol used to say I built things for strangers and forgot to build things for myself. She wasn't wrong, but she loved me anyway, for 41 years, until the pancreatic cancer took her from me in the spring of 2021. After Carol passed, the house felt like a museum. Every room had her fingerprints on it. The yellow curtains she picked out in 1998, the little herb garden on the kitchen windowsill she replanted every March. I kept watering those herbs for almost a year after she was gone. I don't know why. I just couldn't stop. My son Daniel was 38 at the time. He lived about 40 minutes away in a newer development outside of Columbus with his wife Stacy and their 2 kids, my grandchildren Owen and Lily. After Carol died, Daniel started calling more, coming by on weekends, helping me with the yard. I was grateful. I thought grief had opened something in him, softened him somehow. I thought we were getting closer. I should have paid more attention to Stacy. She was always pleasant on the surface, smiling, asking about my health, complimenting the house. But there was something transactional about it, like she was taking inventory. I noticed she walked through every room whenever they visited, lingering in the doorways, looking at the ceilings and the baseboards. I told myself she just appreciated old craftsmanship. The house was built in 1962, solid brick, 3 bedrooms, a full basement on just over half an acre. Carol and I had paid it off completely by 2004. About 8 months after Carol died, Daniel sat me down at the kitchen table and told me he and Stacy were struggling. The mortgage on their place had adjusted. His contracting business had slowed down during the pandemic and never fully recovered. And Stacy had left her job to take care of Lily, who had some health issues that year. He looked genuinely exhausted. His eyes had that hollowed-out look I remembered from when he was a teenager going through something hard. I didn't hesitate. I told them to move in with me. There was plenty of room. It would help them save money, get back on their feet. And honestly, I wanted the noise back in the house. I wanted Owen running down the hallway. I wanted to smell someone else's cooking in the kitchen. I was lonely in a way I hadn't admitted to anyone, including myself. They moved in 6 weeks later. The first few months were actually good. I'm not going to pretend it was all bad from the start, because that wouldn't be true. We had dinners together. Owen and I worked on a birdhouse in the garage. Lily started calling me Pop Pop. And that right there, was worth everything. I felt like I was living again. But Stacy started making small comments. That the house needed updating. That the neighborhood was changing. That a place like this, in this location, was worth a lot more than people realized. She'd pull up real estate listings on her phone at the dinner table and say things like, "Can you believe what this sold for? And it's not even as nice as this place." I'd changed the subject. Daniel would stay quiet. Then, around month 4, the comments became suggestions. Maybe I should think about downsizing. Maybe a condo would be easier to maintain at my age. Maybe it made more sense financially to leverage the asset. That was her phrase, leverage the asset, while the market was still strong. I told her I wasn't interested in selling. This was Carol's house. This was my house. I planned to live in it until I couldn't anymore. She smiled and said, of course, she completely understood. 3 weeks later, Daniel came to me with a document. He explained it carefully, the way you explain something to someone you think might not fully understand. He said a financial advisor, one I'd never met, one Stacy had apparently found, had suggested a way to protect the house from estate taxes and probate complications. All I needed to do was add Daniel's name to the deed, just to streamline things for the future. He said it was what most families did. He said it was smart planning. I looked at that document for a long time. I want to be honest with you. A part of me knew something was off. I'd spent 34 years reading contracts, reviewing project documents, understanding what signatures meant. But this was my son. This was the boy I'd coached in Little League, driven to college, danced with at his wedding, and I was 66 years old and tired and lonely, and he was sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd helped him with his homework 30 years ago. I signed it. I added his name to the deed. Within 2 months, everything changed. It started with small things. Stacy began referring to the house as our home in conversations with her friends. I'd hear it through the walls. Daniel stopped asking if it was okay to make changes and just started making them. He replaced the kitchen faucet without mentioning it. He had the basement carpeted. He planted new shrubs along the front walk and pulled up the rose bushes Carol had planted the year we moved in. When I said something about the roses, he told me the bushes were dead anyway. They weren't dead. They were dormant. There's a difference. Then one evening, I came downstairs and found Stacy on the phone in the kitchen, talking to what sounded like a real estate agent. She had a notepad in front of her with numbers on it. When she saw me, she hung up and said she was just getting a general estimate for insurance purposes. I didn't say anything, but I went to my bedroom and I sat in the dark for a while. And I finally let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for weeks. They were going to sell my house. I called my daughter Patricia. She lives in Phoenix. We've always been close. And told her what was happening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad, you need to talk to a lawyer." I told her I didn't want to make a big thing out of it. She said, "It's already a big thing. You just haven't admitted it yet." She was right. She's usually right. I made an appointment with an attorney named Gerald Hicks, a real estate and estate planning lawyer whose office was downtown. I didn't tell Daniel or Stacy. I drove myself there on a Tuesday morning and laid out the whole situation. Gerald listened without interrupting. When I was done, he pulled out a legal pad and asked me a series of very specific questions. When he finished, he leaned back and said, "Mr. Raymond, once you added your son's name to that deed, you created a joint tenancy. Depending on how it was structured, he may have the legal right to petition for a partition sale, meaning he could potentially force the property to be sold against your wishes and receive his share of the proceeds." I stared at him. "Now," he said, "that's the worst-case scenario, and it would require court proceedings. But I want you to understand the position you're in." I drove home in silence. I don't remember most of that drive. I remember pulling into the driveway and sitting in the car looking at the front of the house, the brick my father-in-law had helped me point and repair in 1978. The front steps Carol had swept every Saturday morning. The window of the room where both my children had slept as babies. I walked inside and Daniel was in the living room watching television. I sat down across from him and I said, "I need you to tell me the truth. Are you and Stacy planning to sell this house?" He muted the TV. He didn't look at me right away. Then he said, "Dad, we've been really struggling. You know that. The equity in this property could set us up for the next 20 years. You'd get your share, a significant amount. You could buy a nice condo, something easy to maintain, and still have money left over." I said, "This is your mother's house." He said, "Mom is gone." I don't have words for what I felt in that moment. I'm not sure there are words. I looked at my son, a man I had raised, a man Carol had loved fiercely and completely, and I felt something close very quietly inside me. Not in anger, just in finality. I said, "I'm not selling." He said, "You may not have a choice." The next 4 weeks were the worst of my life, and I lived through Carol's illness, so that tells you something. Daniel stopped speaking to me except when necessary. Stacy walked through the house with a cold, proprietary energy, like she was mentally sorting what to keep and what to donate. I stopped eating meals with them. I started spending most of my time in the garage, at the old workbench where I'd built things for years, surrounded by the tools I'd collected since my 20s. One night, I found a brochure for a senior living community on the kitchen counter. It was facing up, centered on the counter, placed there deliberately. No note, just a brochure. I picked it up, looked at it, and set it back down. Patricia called me every few days. I told her things were bad, but I didn't want her flying out, didn't want to make it a bigger crisis than it already was. She asked if I was eating. I told her I was fine. She said I didn't sound fine. I told her I was working on it. Gerald Hicks was working on it too. He'd been digging into the deed transfer and found something useful. The way it had been structured, as a joint tenancy with right of survivorship rather than a tenancy in common, actually complicated Daniel's ability to force a partition sale without my agreement. It wasn't impossible, but it would require a legal process that would take time and cost money. Gerald said if I wanted to, I had grounds to pursue a deed correction, arguing that I'd signed under incomplete disclosure of the consequences. It wasn't a slam dunk, but it was something. Then came the Thursday morning that I want to tell you about. The morning that changed everything. I came downstairs at 7 o'clock and found Stacy in the kitchen with 3 large cardboard boxes. She was going through the shelves in the living room. Carol's shelves, with the framed photographs and the small ceramic pieces Carol had collected over 40 years of marriage. She was wrapping things in newspaper and placing them in the boxes. I stood in the doorway and said, "What are you doing?" She turned around and said without any hesitation, "We're going to have the house professionally staged. The agent says personal items photograph poorly." I said, "You haven't listed this house." She said, "We're preparing to." I said, "You do not have my permission to touch anything in this house." She set down the ceramic bird she was holding, a small blue heron Carol had bought at a craft fair in Vermont the summer before she got sick, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as tired contempt, like I was a problem she had run out of patience for. She said, "Raymond, this isn't really your call anymore." I walked to those boxes, I took every single item out of them, I placed them back on Carol's shelves, and I called Gerald Hicks from the kitchen while Stacy was still standing there. Daniel came home that afternoon, and the conversation was the worst we'd ever had. He told me I was being unreasonable. He told me I was living in the past. He told me I was putting my attachment to a house above the well-being of his children, my own grandchildren. That one landed hard. I think he knew it would. I told him to let me think. That night, I called Patricia and told her everything. She was on a flight to Columbus the next morning. She didn't ask. She just came. Patricia is 61, sharp, organized, and she has never in her life been afraid to say a hard thing to someone who needs to hear it. She arrived at noon, and by 1 o'clock she had sat Daniel down at the kitchen table and laid out, clearly and calmly, exactly what Gerald Hicks had told me, exactly what Daniel's legal exposure was, and exactly what Patricia intended to do if he took one more step towards selling that house without my full, informed, voluntary consent. Daniel looked at her and then at me and said, "You went to a lawyer against your own family?" Patricia said, "You went to a real estate agent against your own father. That started it." 3 days later, Daniel and Stacy moved out. It wasn't dramatic in the end. It was quiet and cold and sad. I helped Daniel carry boxes to his truck, the same way he'd helped me move things into this house 30 years earlier. We didn't talk much. Owen hugged my leg before he got in the car. Lily waved at me from the back window as they drove away. I stood in the driveway for a long time after they left. I went inside and I sat in the kitchen for probably an hour without moving. Then I got up and I watered Carol's herbs on the windowsill. Some of them had died while all of this was happening. I hadn't been paying attention. That evening, I went out to the garage to put some tools away, and I found something on the workbench. My old toolbox, the big red Craftsman chest I'd had since 1989, had been pulled out from its usual spot and left in the middle of the workbench. The lid was closed, which was unusual. I always left it open. Taped to the lid was a folded piece of paper. I stood there for a moment. Then I opened the note. It was from Daniel. "I'm going to tell you what it said, because I think you need to hear it." He wrote, "Dad, I don't know when you'll find this. I'm sorry, not for wanting to take care of my family. I'll always believe that was right. But for the way I did it, for not asking you, for not telling you the truth about what the lawyers said, for letting Stacy take Carol's things off the shelf. That was wrong. I knew it was wrong while it was happening. I don't know how to fix it yet, but I'm going to try. Open the box." I opened the toolbox. Inside, underneath a folded cloth, were two things: a bank envelope, and beneath it, a smaller envelope with my name on it in Carol's handwriting. I sat down on my workshop stool. The bank envelope contained a cashier's check made out to me. The amount was $47,000, the money Daniel had apparently borrowed from the equity line he and Stacy had taken out on their own house before everything fell apart. Gerald later told me it was likely his way of trying to undo some of the financial damage without going through lawyers. It wasn't the full value of what had been at stake, but it wasn't nothing. The second envelope, the one in Carol's handwriting, I held for a long time before I opened it. Carol had written it 3 weeks before she died. She had given it to Daniel, apparently with instructions to give it to me when the time was right. He had carried it for almost 2 years. I still don't fully understand why he chose that moment to give it to me, in that toolbox, on that day. Maybe guilt, maybe grief. Maybe he finally understood what she meant by the right time. Carol wrote, "Raymond, if you're reading this, something has gone sideways. Probably something with the house or the kids, because those are the things that go sideways. I need you to remember something. You built that house into a home, not because of the brick and the mortar, but because of what you put into the people inside it. The same people who might be making you crazy right now. Don't let them make you hard. You're not built for hard. You're built for patient. Stay patient. I love you. I'll be watching the birds." The birdhouse, the one Owen and I had built together in the garage 6 months earlier, it was hanging outside the kitchen window. I'd put a Carolina wren in it, in pencil, on the bottom of the wood. Owen's idea. I sat in that garage for a long time. Over the following months, things changed slowly. Daniel and I didn't reconcile overnight. It took many conversations, some of them painful. One of them in Gerald's office, with both of us across the table working through what had happened legally and financially. Stacy and I have a polite distance now that I think will probably always be there. I've accepted that. But Owen calls me on Sundays, and Lily still calls me Pop Pop. And Daniel came over last spring and helped me replant Carol's roses along the front walk. The actual rootstock had survived after all, underground, waiting. They're growing back now. I kept the house. I still water the herbs on the kitchen windowsill. Not all of them made it, but enough of them did. I want to tell you something before I finish, because I've thought about it a lot in the year since all of this happened. I could have protected myself better, legally and financially. And if you are in a situation where someone is asking you to sign something that involves your home or your estate, please talk to a lawyer first. Not because you don't trust your family, but because love and legal documents are two completely different languages, and assuming one means the other is how good people get hurt. But I also want to say this. I signed that document because I wanted to believe my son needed me, and maybe that wasn't weakness. Maybe that was just what fathers do. They believe in their children even when they probably shouldn't. I've made peace with that part. The hardest thing wasn't the legal fight, or the sleepless nights, or even Stacy standing in my living room wrapping Carol's things in newspaper. The hardest thing was looking at my son across that kitchen table and recognizing, in the worst possible moment, how much he was like me. Stubborn, certain he was right. Willing to go too far for the people he loved. I don't say that to excuse what he did. I say it because it's true. And because Carol, who was right about most things, would have said it first.